let me officially get the session going. My name is Patrick Heller, and I'm here in Providence, Rhode Island. I'm a sociology professor at Brown University. And when I joined the Zoom, I was expecting someone from SASE, a technician, would be here to help us out. But instead, I'm very happy to report that the said technician is none other than Annelies Freiberger, who is the executive director of SASE. So it's a great honor to have Annelies with us. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank her for just the extraordinary amount of work that she's done putting this conference together. This is a huge operation, not only these virtual sessions, but also the extended weekend that many of us will be attending in Rio. And I myself will be there, and I'm very much looking forward to being there. Rio is a wonderful place, and it's a very exciting conference, and I know many of you will also be there. So today's session is entitled The Welfare State in the Global South, the Central Role of Public Social Services. And this is part of a mini conference that has been organized this year as part of SASE. The mini conference is on the welfare state and inequalities in the Global South. This is the first panel, the virtual panel. But I just want to remind everyone that there will be 3 in-person panels at SASE in Rio next week. And I, along with Eduardo Marquez, who's here with us today, and Renata Bashir, and my colleague at Brown, Prerna Singh, are the organizers of this mini conference. And again, we're just extraordinarily grateful to SASE for hosting this mini conference. You know, obviously you're all here because you all believe, as I do, that the future of the welfare state in the Global South is the single greatest challenge of the 21st century, addressing not only issues of inequality, but as we'll hear today, the very pressing and existential issue of sustainability. So it's very exciting to be able to start this series of sessions with a session in which we have 3 quite extraordinary and very ambitious papers. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing them. And I'm going to begin by very briefly introducing the papers and the discussants, and then we'll start the presentations. Our first paper will be from Ian, and feel free to wave and identify yourselves as I introduce you. Ian Gough, who's at the London School of Economics in the UK, and Ian's paper is on universal basic services, the center of an eco-social policy. Our second paper is a joint paper. I believe it'll be presented, and I'm going in the order of the SASE official session. So Cecilia Lustosa, who's with us today, and Cecilia is from the Federal University in Alagoas in Brazil, and her co-authors on this paper are Helena Maria Martins Lastres, who I don't think is with us, but may be joining us, Jose Eduardo Casciolato, and Valdenia Apolinario. That will be the second paper. And the third paper will be presented by Celia Kerstenetzky, who is with us, and I believe family is with us too. And that paper has as co-authors Mario Alvarenga, Ricardo Biszewski, who's also with us, I believe, and Lucas Costa, who's also here today. So each presenter will have 20 minutes. They have PowerPoints that they'll be sharing with us. And then we're very fortunate to have Peter Evans with us. And Peter, you're in Albuquerque, right? You have to unmute yourself.
I'm in Albuquerque.
Peter Evans is with us from Albuquerque, and Peter's from the sociology department at UC Berkeley. And he will take 10-15 minutes after the papers have been presented to comment. And then we'll open things up. Given I don't think we need to use the chat box. I think this is a small enough group that if you have questions after the presentations and Peter's commentaries, simply wave or use the raise hand function and I'll call on you. We have 90 minutes, but since we're the last session of the day, we can cheat a little bit and go beyond those 90 minutes. So we'll make the most of that. So again, with all my gratitude to Annelies for her extraordinary work in making all of this happen, and my thanks to her for being with us today and helping us address a few technical issues. We're ready to go. So Ian, and again, I'd ask that people mute themselves, but leave their videos on. Ian, you have 20 minutes.
Right, thanks. And now, how about that? Is that clear? Can people see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to this. I wish I was in Rio, but I'm not. I'm in London. And the main reason is that I'm now taking a vow not to fly anywhere if possible. And getting to Rio without flying is really tricky. I did look into it. It's several months of travel. I don't have a paper, but I've written a great deal on universal basic services and on eco-social policy. So I hope you'll forgive that I've not written a special paper for this conference, and they're all available on my website. Okay, so I've got 20 minutes, and I'll try to stick to that. One of the papers is this report I did for the European Trade Union Institute called 2 Scenarios for Sustainable Welfare, and which has had quite a bit of discussion. Today, I'm only going to talk about the first scenario and not the second one, which is moving much more radically towards a sufficiency economy. So the essence of this first scenario is to combine the Green New Deal with universal basic services, or what we call a social guarantee. And that's the social aspect of it that I'll be talking about mainly. The paper is written from the point of view of Europe and the OECD, sort of richer countries, but I hope it's of some interest to this discussion. So here's the ecological threat. This is the climate breakdown. Anything which is yellow, orange, or red on this map indicates a higher temperature over the last century. And noticeably here, I suppose, especially is the rise in temperatures in the Arctic region, but it's across the world. And if you just look 20 years back, this picture is a lot more yellow than the present one. And this is what needs to be done to limit warming to 1.5 degrees or to 2 degrees centigrade by 2050. And it shows the rise in greenhouse gas emissions, that's carbon and all other greenhouse gases, up to 2020, and then the abrupt reversal and sort of ferocious decline which is necessary in order to achieve those climate targets. And also at the top, there's a line showing what will happen, and the red line there, even that is if all countries stick by and implement the contributions which they submitted to the Paris conference. So it's a colossal reversal of everything we've known before. A major transformation of the whole global economy is going to be needed. So where's social policy come into all this? So the first thing that needs to be done is that social policy must start taking these ecological limits seriously. There's a distinction between biophysical tipping points and the definition of safe spaces or planetary boundaries. I could go into that, but there's a pretty clear agreement on what needs to be done to achieve these safe spaces. There was an agreement on the net zero by 2050 goal established at the Glasgow summit last year. But the planet is still on course for about 3 degrees of warming if we add up these national contributions. And these contributions, remember, are based on territorial, not consumption-based emissions. So that the demand for countries like Britain, in fact, much of the north of the global north, the consumption-based emissions exceeds their territorial emissions by a very large amount. So that's another factor which has to be taken into account. I want to argue that this is intimately bound with the egregious inequality which we presently face. Inequality in climate impacts, which are pretty well known, that the tropical and poor areas will suffer more greatly. Inequality in climate change responsibility. Jason Higwell's latest figures here are quite startling. If you look at the cumulative consumption-based emissions of different countries, above that necessary to provide a minimal amount of energy, then you have the US is responsible for 40% of this excess, the EU 29%, and the Global South 8%. And then there's thirdly, inequality in intranational emissions. The class dimension of consumption and ecological responsibility must be tackled simultaneously, or a grave injustice will be perpetrated even in the richest countries of the North in the name of saving the planet. We must look at who's emitting within countries as well as across countries. Let me take this, make a note of the time. So the basic message is that the goal must be sustainable or sustainable well-being, an economy of sufficiency, and that's what I'm writing on at the present. Sufficiency is the safe and just space between a social floor and an ecological ceiling. The social floor is the meeting of universal human needs. I've argued in a whole series of writings, and I've tried to justify this emphasis on needs in some of these writings. De facto, the ceiling is the current best estimate of safe planetary boundaries. So we've got here an idea of floors and ceilings, and we must stick between these two. And we can apply this to the notion of well-being, to the notion of income and wealth, to consumption and to production. And that's what I'm trying to write on at present. So I'll look first of all at the sort of ecological pillar, if you like, and then the social pillar of this of this first stage for sustainable well-being. So the ecological pillar, there's a lot of discussion on green transition, and that can include a vast array of initiatives to achieve a radically decarbonized economy. My colleague at the LSE, Nick Stern, has written very positively and greatly on this. But then within that, we've got the notion of a just transition, which recognizes some of the social implications. The EU has a no one left behind clause, which is trying to get at this. But it's mainly restricted, I think we can say, to specific regions of the EU, for example, Poland and Germany, which rely greatly on coal mine. So it's looking at that policies should be in place to protect those regions and social groups immediately affected by decarbonisation and shifting away from fossil fuels. But then the Green New Deal, I want to distinguish this as well, is a more integrated eco-social programme. There's some recognition here of synergies and co-benefits between the ecological and the social. Yet even here, the EU Green Deal is rather narrowly focused on education and training, a bit of social protection. And others amongst us are asking, where are social rights? Where's the social platform? Where's the welfare state? But just before I go on to that, the essence then of a Green New Deal, as far as I'm concerned, is that it marks a clear break with early reliance on carbon pricing, which is what the economists who dominated the IPCC for 30 years were always banging on about. And of course, it's important. Carbon pricing is important. But the Green New Deal also involves heavy upfront investment, public and private investment. And it's interesting, we're seeing this now in Biden's action, the rescue plan and the American jobs plan, even though that has been cut right back by Congress. It's a fairly substantial sum of money, about 500 billion, which is proposed to be invested there. The EU Green Deal is talking about 1 trillion euros over 10 years, with more coming from the European Central Bank. So there's a recognition here that carbon pricing alone won't be enough, and we need big upfront investment. Adam Tooze has recently argued that this is a colossal amount of $4 trillion per annum for over the next decade or more. So that's all I'm going to say on the ecological side, but we can talk about it more. Then on the social side, there's the notion of the social guarantee, which has been developed especially by Anna Coote and others. And this is the diagram they use to illustrate this. On the left-hand side, we have monetary guarantees, which effectively fall into 3 categories. Guarantees of employment, job guarantees, for example, or job stimulate or green jobs guarantees. Secondly, money wages, minimum wages, fair wage policies, strengthening trade unions and collective bargaining. And thirdly, disposable incomes, bringing in the state, and the whole notion of taxation and spending on transfers and guaranteed minimum income. So that's the right-hand side. That's a great chunk of social policy, though even that moves social policy away towards wages and employment, away from specifically transfers and taxation. But I want to concentrate on the right-hand side here, the notion of universal services. And we illustrate here education, health and social care, housing, childcare, digital access, transport. So the notion here is that this is the idea of universal basic services, which some of us have been advocating for several years now, extending the scope of social policy to include services in kind, public services in kind. First of all, to protect and extend those which already exist, health, education, and a few other core areas. And then to extend direct in-kind provision, free or low cost, to other essentials of life. So it's looking at essentials. Housing is one, care is another. Basic transport is very important, digital access and so forth. So it's looking to the direct provision of use values, if you like, rather than money transfers coupled with private provisioning. We'll say a bit more about that in a minute. I'll talk about it now. So I think this is superior to the universal basic income idea, which has been around now for, it must be nearly 40 years since I attended the opening conference of the European Basic Income Conference. I would argue that UBS is superior because it tackles the provisioning of basic necessities. it doesn't give people money to purchase goods or services from an unregulated private providers. When this is done, as in housing benefits in Britain, it leads to a tremendous increase in rents and in the cost of the transfer. So it extends security of living standards by guaranteeing the delivery of specific services. And it marks a break with financialized provisioning, or should do, even when accompanied by a UBI. And there are many examples I could list from the UK, the way in which financialized provision of services is causing great damage. For example, the privatized energy suppliers and water suppliers current in Britain. I argue that this is compatible with the Green New Deal for 4 reasons. First of all, it's equality. Free or low-cost provision of necessities is inherently highly redistributive, as this estimation for the OECD shows. This is out of date now, but the current figures I've seen are very much the same. That if you provide elementary services in kind, they account for a much greater share of the total income of the lowest quartile quintile than of the top quintile. Secondly, on sustainability, public services produce lower emissions. We need much more research on this. If anyone's got useful research assistance, that would be very helpful. But one indication of this is the much higher health carbon footprint per head of USA citizens than of those in Europe. The third argument is solidarity and social cohesion. The geographical spread of basic services. Basic services are by definition where the people are. And so it's a great, if we invested more in services, it would make a contribution to the geographical spread and geographical equality. And then in terms of jobs, services are relatively labor intensive, and so would also increase total employment, especially with social and care jobs. So those are some of the arguments for it. Implementing basic services, they're clearly completely different things. Housing, care, learning and transport, they're all essentials, but they're utterly different. So there's no uniform formula to implement universal basic services. But we can guarantee entitlements to certain levels of provision. And UBS can be undertaken at the level of cities and other decentralized authorities. This is not a proposal, unlike universal basic income, which relies on top-level interventions. It can be undertaken at lower levels of authorities. So, and as I said, the unifying principle, why does this keep switching? Is to extend collective solutions as opposed to providing income support and leaving provisioning to market forces. There's a parallel idea here. I don't know if it's much discussed in Brazil and Latin America, of the foundational economy. It's a new sort of economic theory approach which distinguishes different domains in the economy, and in particular identifies a foundational domain, the infrastructure of everyday life, the utilities, infrastructure, services, distribution systems, retail banking, the welfare state, which are there. It's a mundane economy. It's not a flashy high-tech economy, pretty basic. It's relatively sheltered from international competition. And it's, of course, of immense importance to people's well-being across the world. in the global north, it accounts for about 50% of employment and expenditure in the UK and across Europe. And there are parallel sort of thinkings about how we can strengthen the foundational economy. But I see a lot of links between the social guarantee and the foundational economy. How am I doing? So the summary, I'm coming to the end. A new model of eco-social policy is essential, which brings together the ecological and the social. It must require, I think, a more interventionist planning state and will prioritize collective services in kind. The idea is to extend the remit beyond health and education, which I mean is inadequate, as Celia shows in Brazil and elsewhere. But I think to other major areas, I think housing and care are possibly the two most important of those. It can be integrated with green infrastructure investment, for example, to retrofit housing, to improve housing. It can build on civil initiatives at different levels. This is not a big bang proposal. It's a reformist proposal, if you like, and can underpin a guaranteed minimum income scheme. So just to look at the context of this idea, and I look here at optimistic context and pessimistic context. The optimistic one, I think, is this notion that neoliberalism is on its last legs. Jürgen Turbulent says the pandemic sealed the fate of neoliberalism. And the Biden rescue plan, the EU Green Deal, global agreements on minimum corporate taxation do suggest that era is coming to an end, and more interventionist state activities are increasingly being accepted, with the borrowing and even perhaps money supply, money creation, which is necessary for that to happen. Kerstenetzky talks of a Hamiltonian moment in the EU, where by the federal level takes on the debts of the state level. And others talk about the end of neoliberalism. So I think there are some shifts occurring which make possible some elements of this program. But against that, there is, of course, much pessimism, and I'm only looking at one particular aspect here, which is the global financial system. The financialization of public services, of course, undermines a lot of the arguments for investment in social services. I mentioned Lina Levinas here in Brazil, but there are others arguing this across the world. And then there's Daniela Gabor and financial sector economists who talk about a shift from the Washington consensus to the Wall Street consensus. That major global asset managers such as BlackRock are getting more and more interested in investing in the foundational economy. And the role of growing public-private partnerships here can undermine some of these goals. In fact, she argues that it's affecting the nature of state support, especially in the global south, to guaranteeing the profitability of private investments in water, for example, and de-risking these programs to encourage private finance. So the job of the state becomes a sort of de-risking of private sector involvement, rather than the sort of integrated investment programs that I've been talking about. I suppose the Wall Street consensus idea and financialization is an extreme alternative to the proposal which I've sketched above, which, to reiterate, is some combination of a Green New Deal and a social guarantee to citizens of minimum support in the essentials of life. So I think is that the end of it? Yeah. Yes. Okay. That's just summarising what I've said.
Yeah.
And I'm pleased to see the research of Celia and others looking at this wider role for the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Everyone can hear me? Thank you, Ian. A great paper to get us going today. And with no further ado, we'll move on to Cecilia's presentation. And Annalise, I'm assuming you're taking care of the admits. Is Annalise still with us?
Yes, I am taking care of them.
Thank you.
Hello, wait a minute. I'm just in here. I'm sharing my presentation. It's not in the right, oh, here. Sorry. Is everybody seeing? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my presentation. First of all, let me thank you all for being here today. And also, I'd like to thank the organizer of this mini conference for this chance of sharing our work. I'm Cecilia Lustosa, and as you can see on the screen, I represent the article Essential Public Services, Leading the Sustainable Production, Innovation, Renewal of Nations, that was written together with Helena Lastres, Valdênia Apolinário, and José Eduardo Cassiolato. We all are from Rede SISH, the research network on local productive and innovative systems that was set up in 1997 at the Economic Institute of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. The background of our paper is the COVID-19 pandemic. After 3 years of the pandemic, it seems clear that policies capable of stimulating new forms of social, economic, political, and environmental sustainability are required. The article examines the main lessons learned from the pandemic from the perspective of Brazil and the Global South, highlights the relevance of contextualized approaches to health and well-being for both analytical and policy purposes, and addresses some of the main Brazilian responses to the crisis. With the aim of exploring possible policy proposals for the future, the article discusses the opportunity to place the support for essential public service as central axis of a new well-being project. It is stressed that in addition to meeting the main national imperatives, the support of this public service also offers the opportunity to promote new patterns of production and technological dynamism throughout the Brazilian territory. Some key lessons from COVID-19. The first one is the challenge for the financialized neoliberal capitalism state to respond to the crisis of multiple dimensions. The pandemic made even more explicit and also accelerate a set of crises of multiple dimensions: economic, social, financial, environmental, and ecological, which are already being felt on global scale and adding to those the colossal inequality that prevails in the world. It's necessary to point out that pandemic and quarantine show that when necessary, societies adapt to new forms of organizing societies and nation states. As a result, New forms of principles of equal rights to life and dignity for all have also been discussed and proposed. This necessary and urgent change require the state to induce to development projects based on essential public service, such as health, education, science and technology, water, sanitation, electricity, culture, mobility, safety, and so on. In Brazil, the crisis got even worse at the time of the COVID-19 pandemic and has increased the perception that the hegemonic production system led to the impoverishment of people and communities, to the deterioration of living conditions in all parts of the world, and to environmental catastrophes capable of leading to the extermination of several species, including the human one. The second lesson is the lack of sustainability at multidimensional levels that constitutes one of the most evident components of the pandemic. On the beginning of 2020s, among the various discussions of the necessary changes that are taking place, it's worth focus on those that adopting the perspective of global South countries advocate the need to articulate and put into practice a cultural and ideological change that will guarantee the continuity of dignified and sustainable human life on the planet. It's important to note that this debate has gained momentum in the last half century, when a number of Latin American authors argue that environmental degradation and the devastation of natural resources resulted mainly from the high consumption rates of rich countries. Thus, for Latin America perspective, we propose to reflect on the main revelations that the current pandemic unveils, the process it accelerates, and the important lessons we can learn from it. This discussion highlights the issue of power and the need to deconstruct and decolonize the perception of development as progress, and to repoliticize the debate about social ecological transformation in 2020s. The third key learning is the role of the state. The pandemic has intensified a great debate about new forms and roles of states and accumulation regimes. While some foresee and fear the digital policy state as successful model against the pandemic, others criticize the fallacy to the return of the state, whose action always end up directing more public resources to big banks and companies than to small agents and poor population. In all these important reflections, many argue that the most relevant lessons of the pandemic refers to the need to establish new and sustainable forms of egalitarian development and coexistence with nature. Others add that in any alternative, democracy is the most appropriate regime to guarantee freedoms and deal with the immense challenges. The fourth lesson is the crucial role of the essential public service and advantage of positioning them as the axis of new development projects. While the pandemic has brought light the fatal consequence of ignoring the relevance of essential public service, it has put them back at the center of attention around the world. Responses to the pandemic came from organizations that provide this service, especially those related to public health. They were the ones who took the lead in actions aimed at mitigating the devastating effects of the pandemic and seeking treatment and prevention of disease, demonstrating their fundamental importance to society. The search for knowledge and solution inspired and mobilized health and ICT organization in a crucial moment of their existence, marked by cuts in resource, question, and even persecution. The relevance and quality of their response resulted both in increase of their social recognition and strengthening of their legitimacy. The fifth key learning are the impacts of environmental degradation on health. Epidemics like extreme weather phenomena are not natural disasters. They are anthropogenic. By invading forest ecosystems, destroying the habitats of many species and manipulating plants and animals, the emergence of new diseases is encouraged. The COVID-19 pandemic was a tragedy announced by ecologists long before its emergence. They have been drawing attention to the growing risk of disease caused by zoonotic viruses that are transmitted from animals to humans and should therefore be considered as a priority on the international health agenda. It's essential to discuss the current pattern of production and consumption, seeking development based on systemic sustainability. But change the pattern of production and consumption is not only a matter of technological change towards cleaner production process and inputs. It's above all a political issue. This change implies reorganizing the direction of development through public policy that focuses on essential public service and stimulates the economy to generate occupation, employment, and income. In this sense, this service can be considered a vector of a new development project. The sixth lesson is the relevance of the systemic and contextualized view of development. The pandemic has made even more visible the importance of overcoming the distortion of arising from fragmentation and the contextualization of analysis and the ways of promoting economic, social, environmental, and political development. Despite the vast accumulated knowledge, it's necessary to insist that health and economy are not alternatives and to repudiate frequently argued the idea that function of the economy is more relevant than health. It's necessary to immediately explore new ways of living, producing, consuming, reusing, disposing, and living together, especially relating to nature. The seventh key learning is the need to create new models of thought and action and importance of territorial, sustainable, and solidary response. It's worth underlining that confronting and overcoming the pandemic requires the creation of new modes of thinking and actions capable of recognizing, valuing, and empowering solidarity bases and sustainable experience that have been practiced in Brazil and in different parts of the world for years, but which remain invisible through the glasses of hegemonic economic theories and models. Hence, the imperative to implement systematic and contextualized policy capable of mobilizing Brazilian development as a whole and not just part of it, overcoming the models that concentrate income, wealth, citizenship, access to public service, and opportunities. The main response to COVID-19 in Brazil shows the importance of capillarity and vitality of Brazil unified health system, the SUS, were proven through the expansion of its service capacity despite underfunding, underfinancing, and other difficulties, confirming that its potential grows in space beyond the metropolitan regions. At the macro, regional, and territorial levels, a multiplicity of actions by subnational entities was observed, which revealed absolutely innovative macro-regional institutional arrangements from the point of view of public management of the crisis. This has led to new forms of relationship between knowledge infrastructure, society, companies, communities, and people, leaving important legacies, lessons, and expectation regarding the continuity and vigor of these efforts. In the absence of immediate assistance from the federal government, the territories and communities that find themselves in situations of vulnerability took their own innovative initiatives based on solidarity, on knowledge of the territory, on identity, on trust, on diverse partnerships, organizing a network of social protection for those contaminated and avoiding contamination for others, aiming to guarantee life. Popular, favela, Black, indigenous, feminist associations, and young leaders together with educational and research institutes point these territories as place of power, which invent solutions capable of renewing public policy. These territories cannot be associated with poverty and deprivation, but a place with enormous potential, full of innovation, and should therefore be considered in public policy. Our main conclusions is that the pandemic and associated multiple crises made possible to redeem the power of concepts such as public solidarity and commons. It's important to reiterate that the support for essential services can anchor and mobilize significant productive and innovative capacities of wide and differentiated range of activities and companies, meeting the requirements of sustainability and adequacy to local needs and potentialities will demand the production of new materials, machines, equipment, softwares, energy solutions, and products. It also requires new processes and forms of supporting financing, institutional articulation, and coordination. Also, it's worth emphasize the urgence of new generation of public policy for development with a focus on health and other essential public services, those capable of ensuring human life and that others' peace from a democratic, systemic, contextualized, and long-term vision. Legitimacy, territorial cohesion, and social, environmental, and economic sustainability are the keywords of the desired future. Finally, it's important to point out that all these issues, and mainly in the case of health, represent excellent opportunities for joint actions by other countries. There have already been some efforts in such a direction, and certainly such collaboration will be very much strengthening in the near future. And thank you very much for attention. If you have any questions, please do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you for that wonderful paper, a perfect follow-up to Ian's paper and the perfect segue into Celia's paper. And we will be taking questions, but we're going to first go through the three presentations and Peter Evans's commentary before we open things up. So Celia, you're up. Can you please share your screen? And you have 20 minutes.
Are you seeing my presentation?
Yes, it's perfect.
Thank you. So the title of my presentation is Public Social Services and Sustainable Development, Estimating Opportunities in the Global South. This presentation is based on a paper I wrote with my colleagues Márcio Alvarenga, Lucas Costa, and Ricardo Belchovsky. We are all affiliated with the Economics Institute in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. So this is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to give you some background of our research, talk about a little bit of the related literature, what our paper adds to that literature, the questions that we raised, and the empirical strategies that we followed to address those questions and the main results. So we take public social services quite trivially to be those services that are provided by governments with a view to catering for people's social needs, that these services have played important roles in our very commodified modern economies, especially by protecting people from social risks and promoting some sort of social integration. These have been built up over the past 100 years or so, starting in the advanced economies, but spreading to other countries as well, initiating with systems of public education, and in some countries extending to provision of healthcare services and also public transportation, social housing. And by the late of the 20th century, expanding to also to family services such as elderly care and early childhood care, and also to labor market services such as programs of training and retraining of the labor force. More recently, there has been a renewed attention to those services, this time focusing on a perceived capacity of those services to address multiple contemporary challenges, including, for example, the threat of job losses due to automation, increasing inequalities, and also climate change. Examples of this attention has actually shown in the recovery packages after the health crisis, such as the American Green New Deal and the European Union Green Deal, which both emphasize investments in the so-called social infrastructures, which comprise, of course, the social services. When it comes to less developed country, that social infrastructure perspective is lacking in recovery packages in the aftermath of the health crisis. And this is odd because it's precisely in those regions where social needs are really overwhelming and the benefits that might come from attending those needs are largely overlooked. And what our paper does is to investigate for Brazil, one, the magnitude of unmet or underserved social needs, especially for education and healthcare, but also the broad benefits that might accrue from meeting those needs via expansions of public social services. In terms of the related literature, our paper relates to two bodies of literature. On the one hand, there are a number of normative papers that envisage the potential of for social change associated with expansions of public social services. I might cite my own work on a locative welfare state, which is a proposal that welfare states should be more aware of their role in promoting structural change in the direction of more collective provision and more collective consumption. But of course, and more famously, the proposal of universal basic services championed by Anna Kut and Ian Gough, among others. The other set of papers are empirical ones, this time trying to gauge returns on social investments, for example, on cash benefits, but also on benefits in kind. And they are interested in impacts that the expansions of those investments would have on GDP, for example, declining inequality, creation of jobs, and especially jobs for the more vulnerable strata in populations such as women, and in the case of Brazil, non-white people. What our study adds to that literature? First, it frames the empirical investigation in normative terms, that is to say, in terms of the potential of public social services to promote a desirable social change. And of course, the Global South context is really key because it's there that so the provision of social services largely underdeveloped. The paper also enlarges the focus of the empirical investigation to assess a wide range of benefits, including environmental ones, for example, impacts on GDP, wages, jobs, especially formal jobs, but also public revenues and the contribution to a low carbon economy. And finally, the paper compares the performance of the public sector of provision of social services with that of the private sector and that of the economy as a whole, with a view to understanding the advantages of the eventual advantages of public social services when it comes to the variables that we're interested in. So our first research question is the size of a met or underserved social needs in Brazil. So we decided to focus on education and healthcare to the exclusion of other social services. Of course, we didn't find no direct ways of measuring these underserved needs. So we turned to proxies. Our proxy used in this paper was spending gaps of the public sector with respect to some benchmarks. It's per capita public spending that we're talking about, with respect to benchmarks such as the private sector spending and the countries in the OECD area. So our first benchmark is the private sector, a provision of social services in Brazil. Why the private sector? Because it's generally considered of better quality or more accessible. And in any case, it's where the top 25% richest Brazilians turn to when they want their needs in education and healthcare to be met. We didn't find information of per capita spending in private education, so we go around this problem by looking directly at the employment levels of both education and healthcare in the public and the private sector, and try to calculate the ratio employee-user in each one, knowing that 25% richest Brazilians go private, whereas the 75 remaining Brazilians go public. So the private sector ratios, employee-user ratios, were of course typically higher than those of the public, and the meaning of that is that the public sector is highly understaffed. So we did the math and we found an employment gap of just over 10 million employees in the public sector. That is to say, this is the additional staff that is necessary for the public sector to match the ratio employee-user of the private sector. Then we multiply that gap by the average wage of that sector and of course added the value of the needed additional inputs for the final service to be delivered. And then we found the deficit in public spending. So using that procedure, we found that Brazil should triple its health spending and multiply by a factor of 1.75 the spending on education. So the other benchmarks that we used were countries in the OECD area. So one first objection that we should address was how comparable is Brazil with the countries in that club? Well, it's true that the per capita GDP of the average OECD country is 3 times that of Brazil, higher than that of Brazil. But when it comes to per student spending, it's 3.5 times higher. And when it comes to per capita healthcare spending, it's 6 times higher. So in a way, almost 6 times higher, 5.7 exact to be precise. So in a way, Brazil is below the norm. The other way of seeing this is looking at those figures here. While the average country in the OECD area spends 26% of its per capita GDP per student, that figure in Brazil is 23%. And while the average country of the OECD area spend like 7.8% of their per capita GDP per potential user of the health system, in Brazil that figure is 4.2%. But in any case, we decided to look at other parts of the OECD area, not only the average, but to look at also at the per capita spending of the first and the second quartiles of OECD country. In the end, if we confined our attention just to the lower spenders, that is the countries who are in the first quartile of OECD countries in terms of per capita spending in education and healthcare, Brazil should double its current level of expenditure. This to reach, for example, the level of Greece in education and that of Costa Rica in healthcare. This table summarizes our figures that we have in the first column, the total public expenditure in 2019 in Brazil in education and healthcare. The numbers are in billions of Brazilian reais of 2019. And the other columns are the gaps between the public expenditure and the private, and the average, the second quartile and the first quartile of OECD countries. So you can see clearly that for Brazil to match the per capita spending of the countries on the first quartile of OECD countries, it should more or less double, actually multiply by a factor of 1.8, the spending in education. And when it comes to healthcare, more than double. The other interesting information that comes out from this table is that the 25% richest Brazilian have a per capita spending which is more or less equivalent to that of the average Greek and in terms of education, and the average Slovenian in terms of healthcare, which may seem odd because these are the 25% richest Brazilian. But what this signals actually is that there is a huge inequality in per capita spending with this 25% so-called richest Brazilian. So this is the first result that our study delivers in terms of spending gaps being a proxy of unmet social needs in Brazil. Well, our second research question is the benefits that might come from meeting those needs. So those benefits were calculated in terms of GDP, wages, jobs, public revenue, and emissions. To calculate those, we use the income output tables that are provided by the Brazilian National Statistics, the IBGE, Institute of Statistics. And we also extended the IoT to include environmental variables such as emissions. And we simulate actually the impact of a shock of 1 billion reais in both education and healthcare in the public and private sector, to understand what the impact that this additional spending would have on the variables that we are interested in. So the result was that most of the impacts that we found positioned the public shock more favorably than the private one. So this is one first result. The second one, this time, was the comparison between the public social services with the economy as a whole. Also showed that public social services outperform the economy as a whole in terms of multiplication of economic activity, formal jobs, and emissions. So multipliers of economic activity and formal jobs were higher in the public social service than in the whole of economy, and emissions were, of course, lower. So these two results confirm expectations that we had regarding a shift of the sectorial composition of economy towards public social service as something that should be tried because of the benefits that would come from this move. So this table summarizes the results of our simulation. In the first row, we have this shock of 1 billion reais in public health, public education, private health, private education. And the variables are those variables whose impact we want to gauge. So after a shock of 1 billion reais in public health, we would have an additional value added, for example, of 1.272 billion reais. If we compare that shock with the private one, the private shock would generate just 1.102. And the same happens with public education. The public shock on education generates more value added than the private shock of education. And to generalize, all variables that are highlighted in blue show the public sector, public shock outperforming the private one. So we have here value added, wages, taxation, including social contributions, formal jobs, and induced jobs. When it comes, there are two variables that are highlighted in red, and these are variables in which the private shock outperformed the public one, in the sense that, for example, the shock in private education generated more jobs than the shock in public education. But we see that this shock generated mostly informal jobs that are low-paying, precarious, and non-tax-paying jobs, whereas it's the opposite that occurs with the shock in public education, which generates much more formal jobs. 72% of jobs generated are formal, whereas here just 47% are formal. And the other variable in which the private shock seems to outperform the public shock are GHG total emissions. Yes, it's true that public shock generates more total emissions than the private one, but the reason for this performance is that public shock pulls more production than the private shock. We calculated that, but also that by generating a higher level of total wages, they stimulate production further. And since there is no production sector which is entirely carbon neutral or even carbon negative, we would expect that with more production would come more emissions. But if we divide those emissions by total wages, a measure of efficiency of emissions, we would see that the public shock outperforms the private one. So much for the comparison between the public and the private sectors of provision of social services. Let me now go to the other comparison that we are interested in, which is the relative performance of the public social services with respect to the economy as a whole. So in this graph, we have on the y-axis a multiplier of emissions, and on the x-axis, multiplier of formal jobs. And the dots are all the economic sectors that exist in the Brazilian economy. It's 6-7 economic sectors. The best quadrant to be here in is this one, where we would have an multiplier of formal jobs that is higher than the average of the economy. And you would have a multiplier of emissions that is below the average of the economy. Our sectors are within here, that is public health and education, accompanied by just another 19 sectors out of 67 sectors. So it's a good performance in relation to the whole economy. And the final graph that I have to show to you is this one, which puts emissions against economic activity. So in the y-axis, we still have emission multipliers, and in the x-axis we have output multiplier. The best quadrant to be in is this one, where you would have a multiplier of output higher than the average, and you would have an emission multipliers below the average of the economy. And our sectors are within this quadrant, public health and education, and accompanied by just another 25 sectors out of 67 sectors of the economy. So in conclusion, what we found is that first, the magnitude of underserved needs in Brazil is really overwhelming, and it's not justified by the level of resources as we saw, and that this huge gap reflects the lack of political priority that were given to satisfying social needs in Brazil by expansions of public social services in the many development projects in the past. And of course, we understand that to redress this huge gap may seem utopian, certainly is in the short to medium term, but we hope to have demonstrated that expansions are largely justified and in fact urgently needed. And this not only for intrinsic reasons, that is to say, for generating fundamental social goods of quality to all Brazilians, something that is nominally guaranteed by our 1988 Constitution, but also for instrumental reasons to help generate a low carbon economy and low carbon dignified employment through the provision of those very services. So I think the main takeaway of our exercise or empirical exercise is that public social services should be taken seriously as frontliners in any sustainable development or socially and ecological responsible growth trajectory blueprint in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia, for that absolutely brilliant and absolutely fascinating paper. So, on the strength of these three papers, if I may make one comment, it's clear that going forward in the 21st century, we need a social and eco-developmental state that is highly decentralized. And I can't think of anyone who could speak to that more powerfully than Peter Evans. So Peter, you're up next, and you have 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Great. Well, these are not only three terrific papers, but they also, to me at least, represent a general growing new agenda for theorizing the dynamics of the contemporary political economy. And if we can contrast the agenda which is implied which is set forward in these three papers with the sort of what I would call the bad old economistic days of thinking about development, the difference is incredibly clear. In the bad old days, there was sort of a view that welfare expenditure and economic growth and innovation were two different kinds of things, and that you could either provide people with welfare or you could get economic growth and innovative economic change, but they were incompatible with each other. These papers demonstrate that, in fact, the public provision of basic social services is not only more productive in terms of growth, productivity, technological innovation, etc., but has the additional benefit of reducing the ecological impact of increased welfare, increasing ecological sustainability. So we have a vision which integrates our concerns with social sustainability and welfare with our concerns with growth, productivity, and ecological sustainability. So as far as I'm concerned, these papers represent the cutting edge of a terrific new agenda, in addition to being great individual papers on their own. Now, this integration is pursued in different ways in different papers. Kerstenetzky et al. Is particularly impressive in terms of the detail in which it lays out very concretely and specifically the ways in which increased public provision of social services, particularly health and education, would have these positive impacts on the general trajectory of development. I would, however, like to rather than going into the details of the individual papers, I would like to highlight what I consider to be two interesting questions which we still need to confront, and which the papers lead us to confronting, but don't fully confront in themselves. Now, the first is a sort of underlying theme of all three papers, and that is the contrast between what is given different names, but is the same thing. Gough talks about the new Wall Street consensus. Kerstenetzky et al. Talk about the dominance of fiscalist dogma. And Cecilia's paper talks again about the dominance of a financialized economy. So all of these papers set up as the sort of opposing vision, the vision opposed to the vision which they present in the papers, this fiscal dogma, financialized economy, Wall Street consensus, which is another way of saying that the power of finance capital currently shapes development trajectories, okay? And from these papers, we can see that the consequences of that are detrimental not just to welfare but also to growth and sustainability. Okay, so that's a fine setting up of a contrast of a struggle between two worldviews or two ways of organizing the world, etc. But the papers do not provide us with a political path for unseating the current dominance of financial capital. That political path is sort of obviously the papers leave us crying for that political path, but they do not provide us with the political path. The only exception I would note here is that Cecilia and her colleagues focus on the role of the communities most devastated by COVID in providing popular organization to provide services and combat the devastating effects of COVID. So there's a little, shall we say, green shoot of a positive actor there that might in some way be evoked. But that actor clearly is insufficient in itself to provide the political firepower necessary to displace finance capital. So we're still left with this dilemma unresolved. Now, obviously we can't resolve it in the remaining, 15 minutes of this session, but I would just highlight the fact that we are left hanging with that particular dilemma. Now, the other thing that's interesting to me in comparing these papers, and this comes through particularly in a comparison of the Kerstenetzky et al. Paper with Ian Gough's paper, and that is Kerstenetzky et al. is founded on a contrast between Brazil and OECD countries, and talking about the abysmal gaps between Brazilian performance in the provision of public services and OECD countries. Now that suggests that when we look at this problem, that the less developed and richer country contrast is a dominant axis for doing the analysis. On the other hand, Gough's paper is about OECD countries, and it comes up with similar, not identical, but similar visions of abysmal gaps between what we would like to have and what we actually are getting out of these OECD countries. So that sets up this interesting sort of different ways of looking at it. One is to focus on the gaps between OECD countries and less developed, particularly in this case, obviously Brazil. And the other is to see this this struggle that we talked about earlier of fiscal dogma versus provision of services, etc., to see that struggle as a global struggle, which has variations, obviously, if we're looking at the OECD or looking at less developed countries, but that basically the parameters of that struggle are similar across the globe, and that it should be analyzed in terms of being a global struggle rather than in terms of being focusing on this contrast as the major, contrast between different kinds of countries as the major axis of our analysis. So, two questions then. Where is the political clout to unseat the financial dominance of financial capital and enable this service providing, productivity enhancing, sustainability improving model of development, which is advocated in all these papers. Where do we get the political energy to make that shift? And the second is, when we're looking at making this shift, should we see it more in terms of a global struggle and the parallels between the OECD and less developed, or should we focus more on the contrast between countries like Brazil and the OECD countries? So that's my 10 minutes, and we still have 9 more minutes left, according to my watch. So thank you very much. It's really been a huge pleasure to be present in this session and to be able to read all these terrific papers. And I'm looking forward to the 9 minutes we have left.